Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ethics Experts. I'm your host, Giovanni Gallo. This episode is brought to you by Compliance Line. And at the Ethics Experts, we want to welcome you to the show. We're here to elevate risk and compliance and HR professionals to the strategic leaders they are meant to be. And if it's your first time joining the show, welcome. And if you're a repeat listener or a subscriber, I'm so glad you're here. Welcome. And that's what you're going to get with every single episode of the Ethics Experts if you subscribe, that extra special welcome on each show. So hit that subscribe button, share it to your friends, and they'll get the welcome as well. I'm super excited to be joined today by Bob Schuettler. Welcome to the show, Bob.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Yeah, glad you could join us. So Bob is currently a compliance and ethics professional at Cavco. At Cavco, you do manufactured housing, right?
That's correct. We have, at this point, 26 factories around the U.S. We do manufactured homes, park models. So if you go to a KOA and there's little tiny cabins, good chance that's probably one of ours.
Oh, cool. Yeah, super interesting industry with an interesting footprint, and I'm sure, a mix of things that you're covering from a compliance and ethics standpoint, which we can get into. But to start out, this is the Ethics Experts, Bob, and we want to learn about ethics experts. And we love starting with telling us, we'd love to hear a little bit about your story and your career path. So how did you end up in compliance and ethics?
I always answer that the same way, poor life choices. I started out in the trade function, international licensing compliance years, over 20 years ago now. And just throughout my career, did the licensing side, started delving into the compliance side, and looking into the audits, assessments, investigations, meandered back to the licensing side, and really just had a knack. I almost say it's a knack for distrusting in people. Okay.
That healthy skepticism, huh?
That's right. My motto used to be, no one appreciated it, was distrust and verify twice. So I had to stop saying that.
I think a lot of us can relate.
Right. So I, just sort of meandered my way through the licensing compliance side on the international business work, and then had an opportunity with the formation of Vista Outdoor back in 2015 to join there and really focus on the compliance and regulatory side, and just took that opportunity and dove right in head first, and with rose-colored glasses and blinders. So
okay.
Cool. It's been a heck of an adventure over the last 20 years.
Yeah. I always find it so interesting. For better or for worse, it's probably worse. People from the outside kind of have this view of like, oh, that's just compliance. They're just, fill in the blank. They just write policies, or they just tell people no or whatever. They have no idea. There's a bunch of really exciting stuff that's different at each company based on how you're structured and what your company's trying to do. And, I'm excited that more and more these days, as each, year and month passes, people are understanding the power of a good compliance and ethics program to not just manage risk and keep the boss out of jail, but to push the strategy forward, to push the mission forward, to make sure that things go smoothly so people can focus on moving forward, and people being treated right and the company moving forward. And it's kind of different at every company, isn't it, Bob?
Absolutely. I think when I first got into it, really focusing on the compliance and regulatory side, and started patchworking these different functions that a lot of them were orphaned, right? They were thrown into some other functional area, whether it's finance or operations or whatnot, and then meeting with peers and having these conversations about like, well, you're also compliance, so what's in your portfolio? What are you responsible for? And and I'd say one constant was no one's was the same.
Right.
Some of them had, oh no, that's completely separate. Some of it was, oh, I have all this plus a whole bunch more. And it's just a fascinating this approach that you have such a diversity in terms of people's paths into the compliance function, but then also the areas for which they have responsibility for within their company, and how that just shifts and changes from company to company.
Yeah, it is really cool. We don't have to get too deeply into it, but I'm really curious kind of what your team looks like, or what, the matrix of people you interact with look like, or what kind of the big issues that you're in charge with at Cavco. Can you give us a little sense of what compliance means for you and your team?
Yeah, I'd say from a team perspective, it's you're almost looking at the whole team.
Okay.
So my boss is our general counsel, and and has the title of chief compliance officer. But for myself, I handle really the day-to-day compliance implementation execution of the program for the company. I do have an employee that works for me that her focus is really on the business licensing,
Okay.
making sure that our factories can continue to produce and sell homes and deliver homes throughout the different states, or for where they are doing business. And that's the extent of the entire team.
Sure.
From a portfolio.
Powerhouse. Sounds like a real
Oh,
powerhouse
yeah.
team.
That's right. Decisions are quickly made because there's not a lot of
a very
not a lot
short
of layers.
flagpole. Yeah,
That's right. Not a lot of appeal either. But the portfolio, it's I have the compliance and ethics, our hotline, records management, information governance, policies. As I mentioned, our licensing. I also, these are two areas that are really unique and new to me. I also manage our IP portfolio for the company. Yeah, and full disclaimer, I am not an attorney. Never went to law school. I considered it when I was little, and then I got smart and said that's not for me.
Okay.
Didn't have that kind of dedication or focus, I think,
Okay.
to make it through. But yeah, I have our IP portfolio, and then also I handle all of our registrations, our Secretary of State registrations for all of our legal entities across the company. So
Cool.
it is an interesting portfolio, and a couple things that are new and unique to me, but it seemed again, never going to back away or avoid a challenge and opportunity. So
yeah,
it's been a learning curve.
Sure. Yeah, that's really cool. And I love hearing the story of how different people approach this, right? Like it's very centralized, or it's distributed, or we kind of have a small team and do a bunch of committees or whatever. So that's cool, just out of curiosity. And I love the side of it that this industry is just filled with people like you, Bob, who are up for a challenge, who want to do interesting things, who want to make a good impact. And, that kind of looks different in a bunch of different companies, right? Like, if your company had, an IP lawyer on staff or something, that wouldn't be on your plate. But so many people in the ethics community, if something needs to get done and it's not getting done right, we say, hey, you know what? If that's what the team needs, then, I'll figure it out and I'll jump in. And I just, I love, like, I see that across so many professionals and ethics experts in the compliance community that, we're happy to roll our sleeves up and get in. And, so many of us, we got a brain in our head, we're smart, and we got a heart in our chest, and we care. We're smart people who care, and we figure out how to get the job done.
Right. Well, and I think that's a great point in terms of the care. I think the compliance folks, everyone I've come across, and I will say this, and no offense to my HR partners
Sure.
and friends out there, but the compliance folks are probably the biggest champions of culture for in their company.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Even more so than the HR folks. And yep. I think that's why compliance professionals are so interested, in just rolling up their sleeves and taking things on, because they see the value and impact that those things can have on the company. And it's like, well, if no one else is going to take it on and no one else is going to be interested in it, then I'll do it, because I see that value. I see how not doing it or keep doing it the way it has been done historically is not going to do anything good for the company, and it's going to have a negative impact and consequences, particularly from a cultural standpoint.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think I look at the compliance professionals and talking to them and attending webinars and conferences and whatnot, and they really are probably the most passionate cultural folks in the company, even more than your C-suite, and more so than your HR professionals.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that, because I fully agree with it. So I'm glad you agree with me. No, but it's so cool because, I think this perception is changing, right? As people understand what we do. But, even if it isn't changing, compliance professionals are doing that, right? There's this mix of we care about people, we're happy to take on a challenge, and it's this some level of it's, kind of emotion, EQ and IQ. It's kind of understanding doing this integrated thinking of, well, if this thing doesn't go right, this isn't just a license, and this isn't just a, hey, this division might not be able to do this as well. There are people behind this, and if we can build this program, if we can run this cleanly, if we can kind of keep these rocks out of our boots, then everyone's going to be happier and safer and treated more ethically and things like that. And I think that, more than some other divisions, we kind of see both sides of that, the EQ, IQ. We see kind of the risk and the people, and, kind of integrate that together. And I love what you said, that compliance professionals are champions of culture, maybe more than, many, if not, everyone else in the company. And I think that that's part of where this industry and this profession is going, is we're getting more and more shots at being the influencers of that. It's not a monolith. It's not only been one thing, but it feels like, 30 years ago, this was just very like legal and regulatory and risk driven. And it's kind of expanded because if you start there, like there are people at the end of all of those things. And we end up being, in some ways the caretakers of, of the whole organization in whichever way, in all of those balls that someone gives us to run with.
Right. No, absolutely. I think there's definitely opportunity, for compliance. And again, we see most HR professionals, are going to see their piece, right? They're going to be responsible for a certain part, certain segment. And, but as compliance professionals, we are seeing that larger picture. We are seeing, what's going on across the enterprise. So we have that opportunity and really the obligation, right, to drive that attitude, to drive that culture, and to have that impact and make those changes that are needed to continue the value add and support to the corporation.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, kind of seeing that bigger picture, right? Because, there's a lot of work to do in HR if you're in recruiting or, you're in, performance reviews or compensation or whatever. So you got to be specialized in that. And, compliance professionals end up having this balance between, I'm strong at this and the other 8 things I do, I've learned to figure them out.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about that big picture a little bit. So we were talking about a little bit of this in the green room, but kind of CSR is becoming ESG. Maybe that's my point, not yours. But this thing of the company should do the right thing, publicly. Like a lot of times, I think historically, ethics and compliance is not very outward facing. We're not like putting, public pronouncements out. We're trying to make sure everything kind of inside the 4 walls, plus maybe vendors or something, is going well. But, this is kind of, in some ways, becoming the face of compliance, plus a bunch of other things, right? Like, EHS is part of ESG and all of that. But, tell me a little bit about, I think you've worked with companies who have kind of a view and an interest in social perception, maybe on that CSR tip, but, also I think you have a view on this ESG movement, which is in some ways getting talked about a lot. People are trying to figure it out. Maybe it's gaining steam, maybe not. So what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's not surprising to see the CSR, evolving into the ESG, right? If a company's had the CSR, program, putting out their reports on an annual basis, it makes logical sense that their next step is going to evolve and grow, into that ESG. I mean, there's no shortage of companies out there evaluating publicly traded companies on their ESG, whether it's Glass Lewis or ISS, and now it's a matter of, are they actually doing it? And I mean, I think I probably get at least once a day an email from somebody, talking about some conference or webinar or something they have coming up that's, talking about ESG.
Sure.
And, and as we were discussing, earlier, I do a bit of a different take than a lot of these when I attend these conferences or when I even see them is, yes, there is definitely, you can see it in terms of some of the proxy fights and whatnot, where there are some very interested, shareholders and investors and activists, but I think there's also a lot of overbroadening and I heard this phrase greenwashing, right? That's sort of a new phrase that's come out with regards to ESG, where everyone talks about, oh, of course I'm going to reduce my carbon emissions, or I'm going to go net zero, or no slave labor, whatever it may be, or all of the above, and because they think it's going to get them points, with an investor or whatnot. But it's, I look at it twofold. One, not all investors are caring about all the companies that they've invested in equally.
Okay.
I think there's definitely if you're in fossil fuels or another industry, extracting minerals, there's definitely is a lot more interest there, right?
Yeah.
But when you talk about other industries, other companies, you might have the same top 5 investors, but they are not going to have that same kind of interest in you, whether or not you're, regardless of the size of your company, regardless of how many, what percentage of shares they own of your company.
Sure.
And I don't think it's necessarily a matter of those, those advisors or those holders not caring. There might be an extension of that, and they say, well, that's just not an industry that's really going to move the needle for us if we don't push the same kind of expectations and requirements from an ESG standpoint to them as we would, an Exxon or an Apple or the like. So I think there's definitely a bit of that where you can't just blanket statement that, I'll pick on BlackRock because they are definitely the most public, right? As an investor. I mean, they have their own, organization within the company that's looking at, that's dedicated to looking at their companies they invest in from an ESG perspective, as well as their own ESG program and, within their advisory services. So, but they're not looking at, I don't see them looking at every one of their every one of the companies they invest in equally.
I see what you're saying.
So when you go to these conferences and seminars and you have these broad, declarative statements that says
it's going to eat the world.
Exactly right. If you don't have, if you're not claiming you're going to reduce emissions, then you're going to have an activist advisor come, shareholder come in and they're going to take over your board and they're going to do this and that. And it's like, it's just not happening. Right. It's just not that's just not the reality of the situation.
Sure.
And I think there's, you also have companies, I think companies are looking at it, themselves as it's another nice thing to do, or it's another right thing to do. Yes. And trying to find that right balance between, what's that real value, right? Like because no shareholder, no company executive is going to be happy if you just say, hey, we're just dumping millions of dollars into these initiatives, but we don't actually see any kind of return in that. And that return doesn't need to mean like my profits are going up, my margins are increasing. That return can be, I have happier workers. My retention of my workers are staying, right? Like whatever that might, whatever those returns might be. So I think there's a lot of companies trying to figure out what that balance is. How do I move the needle, or how do I even start the process with regards to, ESG, that's actually going to have some type of meaningful impact. And again, it goes to, and then you put that next to what I was starting about in terms of your investors who haven't really shown any interest in what you're doing from an ESG perspective. And that just becomes, really, I think it becomes a harder sell for companies to management and to the board to say, hey, we have to go invest in, in this initiative, that initiative because of ESG, right? We've got to increase our recycling. We got to reduce our, carbon, our greenhouse gas emissions. We have to do all this, and it's going to cost X amount of dollars. And the question becomes, well, why? And it's like, well, because of ESG, because
I heard
ISS
something
gives us
from
bad
BlackRock.
scores. Yeah, right. And and it's one of those like, but they've never brought that up, right? Like we've had shareholder meetings, and it's never come up. There's never been a proxy fight. There's never been anything. So you do have to try to find that balance between what you want to do, and I think the people that are doing the programs, and I think Jim, as you mentioned, there's a lot of different functions that are involved, and it usually does seem to fall, if there's not a dedicated organization to ESG, compliance seems to be a piece, where an area where it falls, or communications, marketing. But I think there needs to be a better sell of that, and I think that goes back to what I was saying before in terms of the cultural piece. If you want to do these different initiatives, giving back to your communities, charitable contributions, those kind of actions that are really going to tie your employees to your business and keep them there and say, hey, I'm proud to work for this company because of what we do in the community I live in, right? It's got to be meaningful, and we've got to sell that, to management, in that way. You can't go in and say, well, because BlackRock at some point, said this on their website, or they're going after somebody else, we better start doing this here. It really got to be, no, that's not gonna get anybody's interest. You're gonna be like, get out of here. But
even if you went to a compliance conference session about it.
Right, exactly. I sat on this webinar for an hour and they told me this. we've got to do it now.
Yeah, that's yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because I mean, obviously it's a topic, right? You said you maybe get like an email every day about it or something. People are trying to figure it out, and I mean, I think, what's kind of interesting, maybe just, intellectually, philosophically, maybe, more pragmatically, is just like how unformed it is, right? It's this thing that there's this high level of interest and high level of uncertainty about it, which to me sounds like opportunity, right? Like there's probably something in there that we can run our program better or something. But also if you kind of have this restricted mindset of like, oh, people are talking about it a lot, I need to go reallocate, 80 grand or 200 grand of my budget to, now doing this thing, you're probably kind of off base, right? And I think a lot of people maybe see it more of that black and white when, that high level of uncertainty, a bunch of people do it differently. You need to come at this with an understanding of like, why should we care? And do we, right? Like, how does this apply to us? Is it, is it equally E, S, and G or what? So, I get what you're saying. Like, investors are not a monolith, right? It's not just like all investors are looking at all investments with the same, rubric and all of that. So I get that. And I agree with you, Bob, that there is some maybe hand waving or over attribution of like how important this is. But I do think it's an interesting kind of sea change that may be happening. And, part of the way I like to talk about it, and, since you have a kind of healthy dose of balance around this, I'd love to hear what you think about this, Bob. I think that this is a new thing that necessarily overlaps. I don't know if it's 20 or 80% with stuff that we're doing in compliance that has like a fresh perspective on it, right? So I think that there are a lot of times where people have been going to the board or the CFO or the execs and saying, hey, we should do this program. We should be compliant with this. We should build an ethical culture. And they've maybe said, if we're not going to get a fine, then we're not going to do anything. There may be a chance to go and advocate for something in an ESG framework. And it doesn't mean we're going to start and we're going to spend, all of this money in the next 5 years just doing carbon footprint, and then we're going to move to the next thing. But you might say, hey, you know what? These things we're doing are ESG, right? Like we're training people about how to not discriminate. We're doing governance by how we manage our licenses or not do fraud or whatever it is. We're doing a bunch of this. So we're, if you guys want to say it, we're already, 20, 40, 60% of the way there to being an ESG company. And it might just kind of like change the conversation a little bit because it's not, it's not a fight over, well, does investor relations or marketing or software development or, R&D or compliance get the next 20 grand. It's like, well, hey, we're all everyone has an interest in this. So let's become more ethical in whatever makes sense to us, right? To your point, Bob, not just like some vague investor said to do this, so we're going to do it, but let's step forward to be a more ethical company. I think it's interesting that that conversation might kind of fall on more receptive ears with an ESG framework instead of a like regulatory compliance and risk framework. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I think any publicly traded company is already going to look at the G part and say, nailed it, right?
Okay.
Like check that box.
Yeah,
right?
Starbucks has been around for 20 years.
Right. It's like, so I'm already a third of the way there. And then when you start looking at, I think the environmental, right, the E part of this is, I think there actually is an easy sell in most companies, almost every company, right?
Okay.
Any company who's manufacturing anything has to deal with waste.
Sure.
Right. You're gonna produce something. You're gonna have some kind of scrap, waste, whatnot, at the end of that production activity. And so to find ways to to upcycle, recycle, reuse, right? All of that becomes, hey, I'm going to, instead of throwing it into a landfill, and you're not selling the idea of, hey, I'm just trying to keep it out of a landfill. You're selling it as, hey, every time we get one of those dumpsters emptied, it's costs us, $5,000.
Exactly.
Right. If I can, and that happens 3 times a week. Well, if we can utilize this material in another fashion, or we can sell it to somebody else who has a use for it. Well, now that dumpster is only getting emptied once a week. So I just saved you $10,000 there. Oh, by the way, when we take the pieces that we're not putting in that dumpster and we're now selling it to somebody else or giving it to somebody else, we're now either collecting money because we sold it, or we're going to end up, our tax department's going to be all over that to take the tax write-off because of the donation.
Right. And then you also save the $5,000 per dumpster.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So I think there's opportunities there from an environmental standpoint. That becomes, that's the low hanging fruit, right?
Sure.
Hey, we can get some, show some progress and improvement there, and at the same time the cost becomes neutral, or saving the company some dollars, or heck, maybe in the end you're making a couple of dollars off of the whole process, depending on how it all works out. I think the other part of the environmental part, and it always gets lumped together, is safety. And I know that sometimes, depending on the organization, they lump that into social.
Sure.
But I think when you're talking about within your organization and you talk about the environmental, you are dealing with most companies are probably dealing with some kind of toxic chemicals or other items. And so, again, you don't want that dumped into your groundwater or whatnot. So I think, and it's just the general safety of the employees. So I think that's another one where there are some low-hanging opportunities for for companies to say, hey, we're already doing that, or hey, there's some programs we can implement that are going to actually be beneficial to us and our bottom line, but at the same time are going to help from an environmental standpoint. I think the one that companies probably struggle with the most is the social.
Okay.
You see, and I don't know if you've seen this, I stumbled across it actually the other day where, the McDonald's CEO, right, is in hot water because of a text he had sent to the Chicago Chicago Mayor Lightfoot, back earlier this year with regards to two youths that were murdered, shot. And and again, here's a McDonald's corporation. I think you would have no problem finding them all over the place with regards to ESG and all this. And then here's your CEO who's really stepped in it with regards to some comments that that he made or he put into a text to the Chicago mayor.
Right.
So I think the social one. That's why I say I think that was a little more difficult for companies to say, because everyone wants to say the right thing.
Yes.
Right. We support this. We believe in that. We're all for this.
Yeah. There's a lot more nuance.
Right. But then their actions don't necessarily live up to it.
Okay.
Or right. The organization may say that, but you always hear what was the old adage, right? Tone at the top, right? Like, you can't get much more of a tone than from your CEO.
Right.
Right. And when he's, when there's those kind of comments or texts put out there, that sends a very clear message right down through the organization.
That's interesting. So, yeah, I didn't know what you meant at the start of that, because I was like, well, I think everyone, because I think there's a lot of compliance that's already doing a bunch of stuff that's social, but you're saying the nuance in it, and I get where you're at, because we did my brother and I did a session for a conference on social greenwashing, right? And it's this thing of like, it's so much more nuance, right? Like for E, it's kind of like you're dumping chemicals into the groundwater or you're not, right? And someone's going to be like, yeah, please don't do that. And for G, it's like, do we have protections in place to make sure that things are managed properly? And, like not a lot of people are quibbling whether you should be preventing fraud, right? There's maybe some discussion around how much you should invest in it or whatever. But hopefully we're not arguing over that.
How much fraud is a good enough fraud?
Just enough.
Right amount.
Just enough. Just like the pepper in the dish. But I get what you're saying on the social. I think we all want to be good to people, but how people interpret that is different, right? And it becomes so politicized, and it becomes so, well, I think that you should be this way, and it's like, well, I don't know. So I get what you're saying, that because this came up in the comments in this conference that we ran, and it came up in people being like, well, I don't know how much to step in that. Like, I don't want to get into this battle. I just want to be good to people and do our work, not try to pick a side in this battle. So yeah, they can be fraught with some of that uncertainty, and did I say the wrong thing? And I said this with the best intentions, but then it turned out wrong because I didn't know that offended somebody. So it's kind of a minefield, huh?
Right. Well, and when you have these large corporations and they put out some, depending on where they're trying to take their stand or what they decide that's the mount I'm going to go plant my flagpole on.
Right.
You're always run the risk that you're going to alienate somebody. Right. You're always going to alienate some portion of your customer or employee base.
Right.
And and I'm not just trying to discourage companies from doing it.
No,
making those declarative statements. Right. And just understand and appreciate that what that means or what the repercussions of that could be. But I think companies are also, they're shooting for the moon, right? When they really just need to be shooting for down the street. Yeah. And I use that almost as a literal sense, right? Like,
take a step. Like where can you get in a month, not where can you get in 10 years?
Right. And really start focusing on your employees. And as I said earlier,
Love it.
local,
Yeah.
get local.
Yes.
Right. If you're, if instead of trying to say, hey, we're going to go try to solve, racism in America, no, why don't you look at programs that are going to have an impact? And maybe they are equity and, and equality programs,
Mm-hmm.
but locally in your community where your operations are, where
Right.
your workforce is, are you doing enough for them in their
Right.
communities to help in that instance versus this large declarative statement, and that's sort of the end of it, or like, oh, we
Right.
donated millions of dollars to this organization or that organization, none of which may ever get to any community where you have
Right.
employees.
Uh-huh.
Right. And I think your employees, again, this goes back to the culture and the retention, right?
Yep.
If you're implementing programs that your employees can actually see because you're doing it in their communities where they live, you're immediately going to, increase that, that pride, that culture of that workforce.
Yeah.
And you're still making that same social impact. And I would argue in some instances, you probably make a greater social impact, by
An
doing
actual
that.
one.
And an actual one that you can clearly identify. And again, it's not about measuring and getting points on the board.
Yep. Hopefully.
It's truly about, right. It shouldn't be.
Yeah.
But but to be able to say, hey, look, we're doing this, and and our employees are happy that we're doing this, and you see that pride and excitement in your employees.
Yeah.
So I'll get off my soapbox on that one.
You know what? Just stand up a little straighter on it, because I'm here for it. But I love that perspective. And I think that's part of why I'm an advocate of like, I'm having conversations with different people around the profession around this. I'm an advocate for compliance stepping into this because, again,
Yes.
not to overgeneralize or roast anybody or whatever, but if it's kind of like that thing you were talking about. If someone is just focused on like HR/compensation, they may not get the full picture. If ESG is just run by investor relations, they're just going to be wanting to, again, overgeneralizing, but just want to like make sure that we can put a nice, 15-page slick, report out so investors will like it. And, I think a lot of employees care more about like, are we actually making people's lives better than like, I mean, what percentage of your, here's a question. If you have an ESG statement or booklet, what percentage of your employees have read that? Probably less than 5, right? And but what people actually care about, like what's going to drive, lack of turnover, attracting and retaining talent, people just being proud of what they're doing, just you doing the right thing. It's that thing of like, is it actually impacting people? And listen, I'm sure, investor relations, or if marketing does it, I've heard of people hiring marketing firms to do an ESG program, and all of that is fine. Someone in that mix on that committee probably wants to do the right thing, but I think that compliance pros are in a great position to say, hey, this whole thing needs to be authentic. This needs to be integrated. This needs to get to the people who it should serve. And, we may not be, environmental health and safety professionals. We may not, have a doctorate in sociology or something, but we can probably help run a program that's going to actually impact people. And that's part of why I think, hey, if ESG is about to, let's just say in 10 years, it's going to matter a lot more for at least 20% of companies in the economy. If that's happening, I think that, compliance and ethics should be at the table.
Absolutely.
So let's jump to something else. We got a couple more minutes. Let's talk a little bit about speak up culture. That's, it's big for us. We care a lot about it. I think it's a big piece of unlocking a conversation within a company around, what is our culture? What's going wrong? What can we do better? You said that's, your kind of reporting and speak up culture is something that you stay close to and manage. Talk to me about, what that looks like for you. Feel free to brag about, any wins or what you're working on or anything like that.
I've actually just finished up I had a conversation earlier this week with our president for manufacturing. So the gentleman who's responsible for all of our factories, about getting out and doing a refresher for our code and for our hotline to speak up.
Yeah.
I'll say, the company, we're not quite at I'd say average with all the different benchmarks you look at from different companies and reports in terms of how many reports per 100 or per 1,000, whatnot. But at the same time, I mean, it's a question that comes up almost every quarter from our board, and from our management team, with regards to, what are we doing? What do we think the causes are, and reasons are for that? We know and acknowledge that right now there's still quite a few that aren't making into the system, right? It's those.
It's always going to be that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. It's somebody went to their manager and the manager took care of it. Right.
Yeah.
They went and spoke to the employee or something, something happened, or they went to their local HR professional. And, and we're not trying to discourage that.
Right.
What we're saying, in our approach is we want employees to continue to do that. We just need to know about it. We need to get those put in through a proxy into the system, so that we have that data, so that we know where we need to focus our efforts and energies with regards to, training, awareness, trends. I mean, I've had the business, business leaders ask, for that data, because they say, hey, as we're traveling around to the different facilities, we want to know that so that we can have those conversations with the site management. Cool. And when we get in there, right.
So I love that they're asking about it. Like, hey, you can, hey, compliance guy, you can help us. Jump in, Bob.
Right.
That's awesome.
Absolutely. And so that's why we're, I'm going to be hitting the road hopefully later this month to start doing some of that refresher in-person, training, and to be able to sit down with, with business management at each of the sites and just go through this again with them and say, hey, this is why we have it. We have posters and banners and, in break rooms and in the factories and whatnot. But, but just to get out there and really put and try to demystify it a little bit more and try to encourage the continued and, engagement from our facilities with regards to it. I think the biggest challenge we, I've always encountered, this is now the second time I've had to, revamp an ethics program or hotline program. And the biggest thing I always hear is retaliation and confidentiality.
Oh yeah. Huge.
Yeah. It's always the biggest issue, where employees are afraid that they're going to be retaliated against, that whoever they're reporting against is going to find out that they're the one that came forward with the concern. And so trying to overcome and give employees that, that peace of mind that, hey, that's not how the program works. Right. I'm here telling you that that's not how the program works. I'm committing to you that that's not how we're going to operate. But at the same time saying, hey, there's, in certain situations, it's unavoidable, like if you're filing a concern regarding an incident that happened between you and one other person, it's, no one else was present. It's pretty hard to keep it anonymous, right?
Yeah, sure.
There's not a lot of anonymity that can occur in that situation. So I trying to get out there and, and make employees feel comfortable with engaging with the system, right? And feeling comfortable and confident they can come forward and that it will be handled in an appropriate, discreet manner is really the big push for the upcoming year.
Yeah, I mean, every company deals with that. The stats are kind of horrid. Just across the economy, that something like 80% of people that report something, experience retaliation, at least in their perception. And I mean, I think the tough thing, Bob, is that there's kind of the layer of the actual, right? The hard reality of this is what anonymous means. And if you submit a web form, we don't track your IP address or whatever. And then there's all the perception around it of at, a job I worked at 8 years ago, someone got retaliated against. So I guess management always does that or whatever. And then you have to fight against that perception, which I think is great that, I can tell by the way you talk about this, Bob, that you have an eye on people, you have an eye on culture, and you have an eye on kind of the integrated way that this all works. It's the conversation they have, the training that they have, the reminders that they get, and all of that. And it's a tough, it's tough to affect that change, especially quickly. But also, if your eyes are on it, and I can tell you care about it, I can tell that you and your team and your company are trying to figure it out. You can change the the direction of that ship. You can change that perception over time. And there are a bunch of different ways to do it, which, we love kind of nerding out on here at Compliance Line. But, it's so important because that's the way to unlock a bunch of the things that we want to do, right? We have to know about the problems. We have to fix them. We have to tell people that these problems get fixed here. And then they think, okay, I can speak up about problems. And also, that's great that these problems aren't happening as much anymore. And it really kind of, it can kind of start to become a flywheel as you kind of cross from mostly skeptical workforce to, largely at least, willing to engage culture, it starts to get a lot of things unstuck, which is exciting when it happens. It takes a lot of work. You can't beat it into people's heads and just, I'm going to send you 5 emails every Wednesday about this and then you'll believe it. But, as you do it, I think the return on investment or just the positive impact that it has on your culture is hard to quantify, but however you quantify it, it's massive.
Right. And I think, for us, I'd say 80% or more of our workforce is manual labor,
Sure.
right? They don't have computer access.
Right.
I wouldn't be surprised some, there's probably a good portion of them who may not even have a smartphone or
Right.
a mobile phone.
Yeah.
So for us, the opportunities to engage with them are really limited, right?
Sure.
There's the only way to really is to get out in front of them or mail things to their homes or
Sure.
so we've got to be creative in how we engage them, and we've got to get our local management and leads and supervisors comfortable with the information that they can communicate that to their employees through stand-up meetings, through monthly all hands, whatever that is, however they engage with them, but really get them empowered so that they can communicate that through that touch labor, that manual workforce that I can't send 5 emails to on Wednesday.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's such a good point. So as we wrap up here, Bob, any parting words, anything that you want to tell to our audience of ethics experts and compliance pros, any encouraging words you want to leave the group with?
I will just say, we are all fighting the good fight. So, just keep it up. There are definitely days that are more discouraging than encouraging.
Sure.
And don't give up on those. And just know that you're definitely not alone, because there's a large cadre of us out there. And, and I think that, we continue to grow that army, on a daily basis. So keep it up.
Awesome. I love it. Well, how about that, guys? How about that? You've had Bob Schuettler here telling you to keep fighting the good fight and to hang in there, because there are a bunch of other people doing it and we're all getting better and we make each other better when we do it. So thanks for tuning in to the Ethics Experts today. Thank you, Bob, for joining us. It's been great to have you on. I appreciate you sharing your insight and your genius with us. This has been another episode of the Ethics Experts, brought to you by Compliance Line. I'm your host, Giovanni Gallo. We'll see you next time.